The subject of today's podcast is as disturbing as it is enraging. This is not a podcast that would be appropriate for young children due to its intense subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised. Today, we will see an example of what can happen when public schools and politicians are more focused on ideology than they are education. You'll see the wake of destruction caused when academics and politicians are so committed to the concept of socialist utopia that they will even attempt to replace the role of the parent in lieu of their destructive policies. Our topic for today is the story of Michele Blair and her adopted daughter Sage, and the absolute hell brought into both of their lives by leftist ideologues. The story will be told by the organization who stepped in to fight their legal battle as the mother and child struggle to survive a series of incidents that will scar both of them for the rest of their lives. Our guest today is Mary McAlister, Senior Litigation Counsel of the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, as they have fought courageously to prevent another situation like the horror story you're about to hear from happening to another child. The first portion of the interview is about the awesome mission of the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, and the second half dives into the details of the Blair family and their horrific experience. Don't miss my postscript at the end of the video to give you the latest on legislation and some final comments from Michele Blair herself. The story of Michele and Sage Blair, today on Resonant Truth. Mary, before we dive into the specific case we'd like to discuss today, tell us about your organization and your role as Senior Litigation Counsel with the Child and Parental Rights Campaign.
Certainly. Well, thank you for having me on. Child and Parental Rights Campaign, we are a nonprofit 501c3 legal organization. We were founded in 2019 by our CEO, Bernadette Broyle, and I came on pretty much right away. And it came out of a call that Bernadette had on her life, resulting from a case that she was involved in Georgia, in which a young girl was assaulted in the boys' restroom in a school because the school had permitted children to use whatever restroom they wanted to in terms of their identity. And that was what the Lord got hold of her heart about going out on her own and to have a law firm dedicated to protecting children and parents from this transgender agenda that was going on, has been going on. We want to, obviously, parental rights are key because it's the parents who have the right, responsibility, and obligation to raise their children in the way they should go. And we were seeing how schools and child protective services and various other institutions were invading that prerogative of the parents and engaging in these secret transitions and other things that they were doing to try to push this agenda on children behind their parents' backs, and the devastating effect that was having on the family. We were founded in 2019, and so since then we've been doing, and we do not only litigation, which is what I head up, but we also work with legislators to pass law and policy, and we do advocacy with churches and other institutions to help them deal with this issue. One of the first things we did is we put together a parental rights guidebook navigating the transgender landscape, which gave parents some tools to use when they were dealing, particularly with the schools, early on asserting their rights, making sure the schools were not interfering with that. And then just recently, we've created a similar resource for churches. And we're in the process of rolling that out and some training to for pastors, congregants, leaders to deal with this issue in the church and to obviously guide their parishioners and leaders on how to deal with it. So
a mother and father in Florida are suing their school district after their 12-year-old daughter attempted suicide at her school. According to the parents, it was only then that they were notified that she had been receiving counseling from the school about her gender identity and that it was kept from the family because of their Catholic faith.
I immediately called the school. I was told I cannot be given any information about the meeting because my daughter was now protected by a non-discrimination law. Essentially protected for me. They presume me to be a danger to my child.
Title IX is the landmark law passed in 1972 that banned sex discrimination in all federally funded K-12 and college education programs and sports. Now, 50 years later, the Biden administration is working to undermine those sex-based protections and to promote radical gender identity ideology as mandated policy in our schools. On July 12th, the administration announced their intention to rewrite the scope of Title IX to include sexual orientation and gender identity, all without congressional approval. The new rules would universally undermine biological sex and endorse an ideology that teaches children they can be born in the wrong body. They would allow school officials to authorize a child's gender transition at school without requiring the consent of their parents. This will do children medical harm. Many children will go on to chemical and surgical changes that end in sterility, infertility, and lifelong sexual dysfunction. Ironically, these changes would hijack the equal opportunities it once provided girls by forcing girls to share private spaces and to compete against biological males in their sports. Visit our website for more information and resources to help you.
So on the policy side, how would you characterize the trajectory of the policy and the legal landscape on this? Mary, as you well know, certainly much more than me, but as I did the research on this particular story, I would love to be able to say this is probably, the only story of this sort, this level of horror that you've come across, but I know that's not the case. The stories are absolutely horrible out there. What's your perspective of the trajectory of the landscape in protection of child and parental rights today? Are there headwinds or are there flickers of hope? Now, I know that the Trump administration is aggressively going after areas of absolute cultural insanity that we see in other areas of America today. But what are you seeing in this space? And is there a shift, even a subtle shift in the right direction that you see on the horizon?
yes, and in fact, it's becoming less and less subtle. We just had the Supreme Court week or so to that case, the Scarametti case, in which it upheld states' rights to regulate procedures, these what they call gender affirming, which are really gender manipulation procedures on children. And the court came out and said, yes, the states can regulate those. It's not discriminatory. It's part of the state's duty to not only protect children, but also the integrity of the medical profession, etc. And so that obviously was a tremendous win in terms of giving the states the ability to protect children.
What implications wider than this children's books that could go against a family's faith, which I was shocked it even got to the Supreme Court, because Shannon Bream just reported how many people were against having those books for their kids anyway. But is there a wider look, if you can, Jonathan, at what that really means across the country?
This is enormously important for many of us who have been waiting for a robust opinion in favor of parental rights. This gets us pretty far along that road. The court here really came in on the side of these parents. These parents did an extraordinary task here in fighting off the school district in this case. But the case is important because the court is saying you can't just make parents and their kids your captive audience. And many of us were shocked when Justice Jackson in oral argument said, well, just take your kids out of school. A lot of parents don't have that option. They don't have the money to send kids to private school, but they also don't want to send them to a school that undermines the religious and moral teachings. Now they have the Supreme Court on their side and they can opt out. And I think it's an extraordinary victory for parental rights.
Yeah, and in my opinion, it would take the entire nation agreeing upon something that we typically see in Republican-led states and municipalities, and that's school choice. I mean, they would have to then take and match some of the money, which we've seen in a few red states, match that money so parents can use that. Because you're right, not everybody has the money to send their child to a special and/or private school. Phil, I introduced you. You're part of the conversation. My question is about these books. What about the topics themselves? Does this actually extend out to, if those conflict with a parent's faith, can they opt out of the conversation and not just the books?
Yeah, I think so. Look, parents, Harris, are in charge of their kids' education, not the schools. It's the parents that get to make parental decisions, not the government and certainly not the schools. What this does is it squarely reinforces this basic notion that seems like we've always known, but in recent past, it's just become a clouded issue. Schools are for the purpose of educating children so that they can go out into the world with the skills that they need to be productive members of society. Schools do not exist to politically indoctrinate children.
Speaking of the president, does his effort to address the size and scope of the Department of Education, is that a factor in this, or no, not really, because the battle here is really not at the doorstep of the school in regarding its policy? This is a legislative battle that then the schools have to abide by. Is that his efforts to change the scope of the Department of Education a factor at all here?
I think it's a positive factor overall because it will return making school policy and regulation of schools to the states, because it is really the state's responsibility to provide for the public education of their children. And we could see how that it will be an advantage, because obviously what's happening, say, out in California and Massachusetts is not something that people in the Midwest or the South, or I dare say even most of Virginia, want to see happen.
Right.
And so if you don't have this federal umbrella where it's run by the administration, such as the one we just had, then the states are going to be able to serve their citizens in accordance with their values and desires, rather than having to worry about, well, is the federal government going to come in now and tell us we can't do that?
For those watching the podcast today, if you're not familiar with the story of Michele Blair and her daughter Sage, you're going to experience some points of horror as we navigate this story, some points of shock and some points of rage. And trust me, following the story, you hit every one of those emotions going through this process. Mary, before we dive into the story, a personal question. You're exposed to some of the dark sides of humanity in your work, and I'm curious how you manage as you see absolutely the worst of humanity. How do you deal with the reality of that on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I of course couldn't do it without my faith in Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit's influence on um, protecting my heart, keeping me. I have a very good, solid church family that I correspond with and work with in prayer. But clearly, I could not do this work. I mean, it's the work the Lord called me to do, and of course, He equips the called. And so he has equipped me. And I think one of the things he's helped me with too is that for about 10 years, I worked with Dr. Judith Reisman, who used to be at Liberty University. Mm-hmm. And she was the pioneer in dealing with Alfred Kinsey and the sexual revolution and all of the horrors that went along with that. And I worked with her for 10 years. And again, it was a lot of the very dark parts of humanity. And so I think that helped me. The Lord used that to help me too. Balance it and protect my heart from what I was seeing, and just having it gives me the encouragement or the motivation to continue doing this work because it is so dark, and the light needs to be shown on it, however it can be shown.
The grandparents who are guardians of a Virginia teenager say they were intentionally kept in the dark about their granddaughter's gender struggles. What happened next was a months-long nightmare. Michele Blair says her 14-year-old granddaughter Sage was bullied, assaulted, and ultimately fell into the hands of a sex trafficker. What's more, after her rescue, Baltimore courts refused to return the girl to her grandparents, accusing them of child abuse for not affirming her chosen gender.
Earlier this week, the Chicago Teachers Union president said that children belong to them while delivering a speech at the City Club of Chicago. She said the CTU thinks that all children belong to it. We like children. We educate them, we nurture them, we protect them, we support them. We negotiate for them, we create space for them, we even have them in our homes. To me, this is evidence of a shocking adulteration of the line between teaching, and we've all experienced great teachers in our history, especially those of us like you and I have spent a lot of time in school, in the seats. That line between teaching kids and raising kids. And it makes you want to really try to understand why that line is being blurred by the left of center political spectrum. Now, I've got my own perspective on why this is. To me, it's very, very clear. But even if I did believe the propagandized claim of that teachers union president, it's a really curious line that they're adulterating in this process. The story of Michele Blair and Sage is further evidence of this as well. And to me, Mary, it's evidence that every parent of a child in public schools needs to be aware of the fact that radicals, certainly not every teacher, but there are radicals in these organizations that see their children as fair game from a standpoint of inculcation and indoctrination.
Yes.
The story of the Blair family starts with Sage experiencing some mental and emotional shifts that I've got three daughters, so I saw a lot of those shifts through their when they were 14 years old. But certainly, Sage had some specific psychological issues she was dealing with during this time as well.
Of course, Michele has shared her story far and wide in hopes of educating people. But Michele is actually Sage's paternal grandmother. Sage's father tragically died young, and her mother was not able to care for her. And so as an infant, she was bounced around foster care until Michele was able to adopt her. And so initially, even early on, Sage had some trauma that she had, from the early times of her, infancy, with being bounced around before Michele and her husband came in to be her parents. And then, as you mentioned, as Sage approached puberty, that sort of triggered some additional difficulties. And in middle school, she was able to work with the teachers and the counselors who would let her know, oh, this is happening today. Sage is having a bad time, or we think maybe she's cutting, or whatever issue she was having. They would let Michele know, and then Michele would make sure she got the assistance and the help that she needed to deal with the issue. As she registered for high school, Michele gave all the information to the school, let them know about all of the background on their mental health issues, so that they were aware. Right. She began school, and trying to fit in, feeling out of place, and starting high school first of all, and having all her background. And so she was, and her, a lot of her friends were talking about being trans, or doing something out of kilter with their gender or something, and wouldn't that be interesting to do? And so she was sort of hearing those messages. And so she had mentioned to a friend, she was having a conversation with a friend, said, I might try using a boy's name, or that might be good for a while, to sort of act like I'm a boy and see, what happens. And a teacher overheard that, and then told the school counselor, and the school counselor met Sage in the hallway and said, oh, are you a boy or a girl? Do you identify as a boy or a girl? And, there's this girl just starting school, with mental health issues, and trying to fit in. Well, I think a boy. And she says, okay, well, then you should start using the boys' bathroom. And, and then we'll start talking about this issue, in counseling. Well, meanwhile, she, I think it was the second day of school, on the school bus. Unfortunately, some of the boys, didn't appreciate her unconventional dress and her short hair and whatnot, and just started bullying her mercilessly, and including, sexual innuendos, sexual harassment of all kinds, and all of this.
Blair said her daughter was severely bullied in her Appomattox County school, leading her daughter to run away, only to be kidnapped and sex trafficked.
And it was verbal, physical, sexually harassed, with constant threats of rape by the male classmates. But despite this, the school encouraged her to use the boys' bathroom.
Blair's daughter Sage had a history of mental health issues, including depression, eating disorders, self-harm, and hallucinations, and Blair informed the school of it prior to any of the incidents. However, the school pursued a social transition for Sage, behind the back of her parents, according to the lawsuit filed by the Child and Parent Rights Campaign. Bernadette Broyles, Blair's attorney, told Washington Examiner, Sage ran away from home due to severe bullying and harassment at school.
The school officials were encouraging to use the boys' bathroom, even though they knew she was being threatened with sexual assault. She perceived herself that she wasn't safe, and she runs away from home. And she runs into the arms of a waiting pedophile who encounters her, rapes her, traffics her to other men, and takes her across state lines into Washington, D.C., and then ultimately into Maryland.
Which is where her nightmare journey should have ended. And this would have been a horror story if it stopped right here, but it did not stop right here. And this is where the story really becomes enraging on a whole nother level. The Baltimore juvenile court system assumed custody of Sage at the instruction of Anissa Khan.
Area Public Defender Anissa Khan concluded the Blairs were not, quote, sufficiently affirming of her new identity. While in custody, Sage was put into a boys' juvenile facility where she was again sexually assaulted, exposed to drugs, and denied medical and mental health care.
She was a 100-pound girl. What do you think happens in this facility? She's again sexually assaulted. She runs away. and then again is found by yet another pedophile who traffics her more and takes her into Texas.
Who brought her to Texas, where she was again sexually molested, drugged, starved, and tortured until law enforcement in Texas finally rescued her and notified her mother, who returned her to Virginia. At that point, Sage's horror story really has only started, because this is the beginning of years of recovery for her. But this is where the legal battle started, and where you and your organization got into play here. So pick up the story from there, if you would, Mary, on what happened after we finally got Sage back home.
Well, from a legal standpoint, we agreed to represent Michele and Sage. We filed a lawsuit in Virginia, in federal court in Lynchburg. And it was one lawsuit, but it had three defendants, but three sets of defendants. One was the individuals at the school district, the counselors, and the superintendent, and then the school board was another group of. And then we sued Ms. Khan for various things that, federal charges, etc. And then as we moved through the procedure, the Ms. Khan's attorney asked that her case be dismissed, claiming the court didn't have jurisdiction over her. And we argued that there was, but the court agreed with her. So she was dismissed from the case entirely, because the court believed that it could not have jurisdiction over her, because much of what she did happened in Maryland. And so she was completely out of the case at that point. So then the case continued with the school board and the school board employees, and they brought a motion to dismiss the case, and unfortunately that was granted by Judge Moon in Lynchburg. So he dismissed the case entirely for saying we did not meet the standards to state a case, etc. So we have appealed that to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals in Richmond. Governor Youngkin did issue executive orders to that effect. Unfortunately, the law that would bear Sage's name has never made it out of committee in the Democratic-controlled General Assembly.
Wow.
So it's not a law at this point.
Delegate from Loudoun, Delegate LaRocque.
Mr. Speaker, I move the committee substitute.
Shall the committee substitute be agreed to? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Substitutes agreed to. The delegate from Loudoun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill substitute has the same three elements as the original bill. One, it provides for parental notification if a minor child communicates to an individual employed by their school they are considering or have decided to transition their gender at school. Number two, the bill provides for parental consent for any measures taken by the school to support the minor child, including counseling. And three, the bill clarifies that raising a child according to his or her biological sex may not be construed as child abuse or abuse. Mr. Speaker, I move the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
The delegate from Prince William, Delegate Rome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for a question?
Will the delegate yield?
I will.
The delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I read the bill, the first thing I would ask the delegate here is, once again, we see the phrase biological sex, and as it is undefined in the Code of Virginia. So the first question to the delegate, Mr. Speaker, would be, how does the delegate in this case define biological sex, and how is the principal or principal's designee, as mentioned in this, supposed to determine gender incongruence, as the phrase they would use, but what we would say is sex assigned at birth, as being a problem or being different than the, quote, biological sex, end of quote?
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to be trivial about this, but it brings to mind the interview of a Supreme Court justice. I am not a biologist, but I do know that it is very obvious in the school context that counselors would know a child's biological sex, having a child that has been present in the school, perhaps participated in different sports, and who would then confide in a counselor. Again, the bill talks about a situation where the child would present to a counselor that they, in their own mind, had decided to change their gender. So the student itself themselves would be likely to disclose as part of that decision in the conversation leading up to it what their actual biological sex is.
And that's been another piece of this puzzle that's been very tragic, is that since Governor Youngkin was elected, we've been trying to get this law in place. And it's a very simple law. It just says parents must be notified, like the executive order says. Parents must be notified if the schools are dealing with gender identity issues with their children. But the Senate Democrats in the state legislature will not permit that bill go up for a vote.
And the prospect of that doesn't look good. You've got a Republican governor. His term ends next year. The two leading candidates for that position in 2026, right now the Democrat candidate is leading in polls. And as you said, both the House and the Senate state legislature are both strongly Democratic. So it's sad that that's where a political line is drawn. Mary, if this topic has covered such a wide range of issues, certainly in the legal landscape, if we were able to give you a magic wand and you were able to pass one law in the United States Congress tomorrow, of all of the potential priorities to isolate in this particular area, what law would you pass in this particular space that you believe really needs to be done on the federal level?
And of course, the key would be enforcing it, which with the present administration is less of an issue than it has been. But I would say even a constitutional amendment, but certainly a federal law very explicitly stating that it is parents who have the right and responsibility to make decisions regarding the care of their children, their religious upbringing, their education, everything. It goes to the parents, and the state is not to interfere with that. Absent, obviously, if there is evidence that a parent is being abusive, true, evidence, you go to court and you prove that the parent is being abusive, then at that point, obviously, there would be an alternative.
Right.
But that it needs to be very clear and clearly enforced that states cannot, as you mentioned about the Chicago Teachers Union, they cannot come in and say, okay, we have the kids now because you dropped them off at school and you have no rights. It has to be made clear that, and this extends beyond the Constitution. I mean, this is part of God's biblical truth that has, the Supreme Court has agreed is an inalienable right, a fundamental right. And just to have that memorialized in writing and made clear and clearly enforced that parents are the ones who make decisions for the kids. If they choose to delegate some of that decision making to the state, they can do so, but then they can also renege pull it back and say, no, you don't get to make that decision anymore.
Because of her experiences, Sage has undergone intensive inpatient and outpatient therapy to address the multiple incidents of extreme trauma. She has also been diagnosed with complex PTSD.
Frankly, it is cruel and irresponsible for school officials to be encouraging confusion, gender confusion in particularly traumatized, young girls with histories of mental health.
Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin has been vocal about Sage's case and recently implemented new guidance in Virginia mitigating some of the policies that led to Sage's experience.
And she says, I don't remember who I was, Nana. I just wanted to have friends. She will need trauma therapy, because it is complex PTSD, for the rest of her life. But I mean, that doesn't mean she's not and won't have, a happy life, but she will always struggle with flashbacks of horrible, horrible memories. But I will just love her through them all.
What's the
Yes.
next step strategically as you take a look at the monumental task of addressing this on the state and local and federal level? What's the next big step in your strategy for your organization as you fight this evil?
Well, continuing the current, our current programs of litigation, bringing the lawsuits, bringing them all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, and hopefully getting the Supreme Court to take one of the cases, and pushing on legislate. The legislative side is going well with all of these bills that now the Supreme Court has supported, where the states can bar these treatments for children, and just to get similar passed. Parental rights laws have been passed, like Florida. Several states have passed what I mentioned earlier, a parental rights law stating that these are the parents' rights. You can't interfere with them. If you do, that you'll face legal action. So continuing to push other states or to help other states with those efforts, and perhaps bringing, supporting efforts to go after some of the medical providers that have done some of this. That is something that is gaining ground now, in terms of, and then dealing with one of the things, unfortunately, that's happening is that some of the schools and others are trying to weaponize child protective services. And that was seen a little bit in Sage's case in Maryland, but to get the child protective services to take the children away from the parents if they're not affirming, quote unquote, the gender, and giving them to foster parents who will. And that's a very frightening scenario. And it's happening in some places. So also trying to deal with helping parents in that situation to not have their kids, taken away under false pretenses of abuse. So that's just, the enemy has all kinds of fronts that he likes to start fighting on. And so we're trying to just, as those fronts come up, do what we can to fight them.
Mary McAlister, Senior Litigation Counselor with Child and Parental Rights Campaign. May God bless you and more than you could possibly expect for your commitment and your mission in defense of families and the most vulnerable in America today. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Childress. It was my pleasure.
As of this taping, the law known as Sage's Law continues to be stonewalled in the Virginia State Assembly. Regardless of the ideologically driven claims of the activists, science is beginning to accumulate evidence to reject their dangerous propaganda promoting gender transitioning for young people. 4 out of 5 young people who experience gender confusion and do not surgically transition go back to embracing their biological sex. Clinical psychologist Dr. Erica Anderson, born a biological male and who now self-identifies as a transgender female, has been one of the most vocal critics of what has been given the propagandized label of gender-affirming care. Dr. Anderson, whose practice focuses on teens experiencing gender confusion, says the activists are making a big mistake to push radical gender change surgery without parental involvement. Here's Dr. Anderson.
And certainly for young people, we need to balance the interests of young people in terms of what they want with what they need. And parents are in a better position in some cases to determine what a child needs than the child themselves. And to my chagrin, in America, there are some people, child advocates, who say, but children know who they are, so just give them what they want.
If you reject this dangerous activism and by doing so promote parental involvement in the process, The radicals paint you as someone who hates kids with gender dysphoria, or hates gay people, or hates leftists. No, wrong again. Jesus Christ died for everyone that I just mentioned, not to continue on their path of destruction, but to save them from that destiny. Here is what the activism looks like and sounds like. Once again, you'll hear from biological male who self-identifies as a woman, Danica Rome, concluding her argument to the Virginia State Legislature against parental notification laws.
They were tired of having to hear kids being used as political props and thrown to the wolves, where in a case like this, there is nothing in this bill, not a single thing in this bill that actually says, well, maybe we're going to take discretion. Maybe in this, we're going to say that in one kid's case, it could be unsafe. Maybe in one kid's case, it could get them hurt. Maybe one kid's case, it's going to create an environment that's not going to be welcoming for them, and that leads to suicide, that leads to homicide, that leads to beatings, that leads to homelessness. And when the delegate presented this in committee and made the entire case about human trafficking, number one, the bill doesn't even say the words human trafficking in it whatsoever, but we have voted today on engrossment for bills that actually deal with human trafficking. But what I would also tell you with this, Mr. Speaker, is that when we are dealing with that case, what happens to homeless youth? Homeless youth are exponentially more likely to be victims of human trafficking, to be prostituted. We are dealing with dire consequences on a bill as reckless as this. Forcibly outing kids, regardless of the safety of their home, regardless of what's going to happen to them when they get home. You can say you think that every single parent is going to love that child, and I wish to God that was true. But if that was true, Child Protective Services wouldn't exist in the first place. And now you're dealing with forcibly outing trans kids, and you didn't even talk to the one person in this body who actually knows what it's like to be scared to death as a 13 and 14-year-old kid of anyone finding out that you're actually trans. You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea the harm you're causing. These kids are watching this right now all across the Commonwealth. Do better for them.
In response to Danica Rome, who has so far successfully convinced the Virginia Assembly to vote against parental notification, our podcast ends with the most appropriate rebuttal of that sort of activist gaslighting that we could possibly imagine. In her comments to the Virginia Education K-12 Subcommittee, the mother of Sage, Michele Blair.
After almost a year, Sage was finally home, safe, alive. Sage is receiving professional trauma care. The first trafficker has already been convicted. Sage has nightmares, panic attacks, rape-related medical issues, but there's hope. I told her she's not broken, she's just scarred. And part of that hope is that in courageously sharing her story, others will be saved. Sage said she doesn't know who she was back then. She wasn't a boy. She just wanted to have friends. But her school, the judge, the attorney, and the doctor were all blinded by their ideology. The consequences for Sage were unspeakable. Please don't let ideology harm another child. Let parents do our jobs. We know our children best, and we love them 1,000,000 times more. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.